You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love the stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely need to make starters these days. While originally based out of Portland, Oregon, imperial yeast has expanded to the East Coast, meaning even more people have access to their incredible lineup of yeast, including popular strains like A07 Flagship, A38 Juice, A09 Pub, and a Brewlosophy favorite, L17 Harvest. So good. Whether you brew at home or on the commercial scale, imperial yeast has what you need to make the best beer possible. You can check out all of their available strains and start your planning at imperialyeast.com. Back in the 18th century, a dark malty ale had gained popularity in Britain as a refreshing quaffer, the moniker of which came from the workers who regularly enjoyed it. Porter was created in response to the more hoppy pale ales of the time, and given its popularity, served to inspire various offshoots that continue to be brewed to this day. This is the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and joining me on this episode to chat about what I believe to be one of the more unique versions of Porter is contributor Andy Carter.
You know, Marshall, it's becoming winter in Los Angeles, and it's only 65 degrees out, and I need a big burly coat, and I can't think of anything better than to curl up next to a fireplace with a glass of Baltic Porter to enjoy. So happy to talk about this one.
Yeah, there is a lot that I love about Baltic Porter. One thing being that my wife's family is from the Baltic region. I've mentioned this a few times in the past. In fact, it was during our visit to Latvia back in 2003 that I tried my very first Baltic Porter, and needless to say, I absolutely loved it. I didn't know it was the style the BJCP refers to as Baltic Porter, but it was absolutely delicious. Now, having never brewed one, I figured I'd take a less conventional approach to my first batch. I look forward to talking about this historical style as well as the outcome of that short and shoddy Baltic Porter with you today, Andy. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. By making a small monthly pledge, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our guest for this month, December of 2022, is the one and only CH from Homebrew for Life.
Yeah.
Chances are a good number of you listeners are already following the Homebrew for Life Instagram and or YouTube channels, but if not, and you enjoy the more, let's call it whimsical and hilarious take on beer and brewing, I highly recommend you check it out. And when you do, I think you'll understand why this session is going to be a lot of fun. If you want to be a part of it, you have to make your pledge at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by Friday, December 16th. 2022, as CH will be taking questions on Saturday, the 17th. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron and all of the rewards we offer for your support over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. Well, the holiday season is officially upon us, which means most of us are in gift shopping mode. I'd just like to remind our listeners to please consider supporting the show by using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're doing your shopping online. Your experience will not change at all, and we get a little kickback, a very little kickback, mind you, for the referral that helps us out a ton. You can even bookmark those links to make them easier to find and use in the future. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd appreciate that as well. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've had the opportunity to brew on both the 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are absolutely legit, efficient, easy to use with a really small footprint. You will not be disappointed by one of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run a really great YouTube channel, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear, make sure to check out what Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com. And don't forget to let them know that Brewlosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Listener Peter Housen wrote in with a bit of beer history after listening to episode 258, where we talked about our experiences with seasonal brewing and beers. Peter said the alleged history of Saison is that it was the beer farmers in Belgium brewed. It's what beer farmers in Belgium brewed in order to give the field workers something to drink at lunch. So it was brewed in the early spring before planting and consumed throughout the spring and summer. Bier de garde, which literally means beer to be saved, is the beer the farmer brewed for himself at the end of the season to be cellared through the winter. Grisette was the, quote, saison of the miners and more industrial parts of Belgium.
It's so interesting to look at the history of all this stuff, and I'm really glad that BJCP preserves it, because what we do, or typically do homebrewers do, is take something and then just make it their own, right? But to know the history, to understand where saison comes from, since saison is such a style that's so much American. It's been Americanized so much, but the alcohol has come up a lot. The hops have come up a lot, and it's really not recognizable anymore. And now people are examining grisette, and I think they're doing a much better job at grisette and bière de garde to really make it more traditional. And it's just fascinating to me. I love the history of Belgium and those kind of little tidbits like that. I always love reading about and understanding.
Yeah, in addition to loving beer, I absolutely love history. I get made fun of by my friends for all these weird tidbits of crap. If I get bored, I'll just go on, read some weird historical thing on Wikipedia or whatever. So, learning stuff about this thing that I love so much, beer, is always really satisfying for me. And so, I'd heard the same thing about Saison that Peter shared, and I didn't want to talk about it too much in that episode for fear of sounding like an authority on it, because I'm not certain about the history of Saison. But the information on bière de garde and grisette I was unaware of. And so I appreciate the lesson, Peter. Thank you for the email. If you have show feedback, you could send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or leave us a note on social media. The new year is near, and we have been working on some stuff we think listeners of this show will really enjoy, the details of which I promise we will be announcing soon. But at this time, all I can do is suggest everybody head over to youtube.com/@thebrewlosophy show. That's the @ symbol, the Brewlosophy without the umlaut, show, and subscribe to our channel. When we return from this break, the focus will be on Baltic Porter. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Exchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Exchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. I have to imagine that when most people hear the word porter, they think of either the classic British beer or perhaps its American cousin, both of which are low to moderate strength malty ales that range from brown to black in color. While Baltic Porter certainly took inspiration from the traditional British porter, it deviated in various ways such that it ultimately became its own style, one with a pretty interesting history.
Yeah. So it started, this beer style, this porter style was relatively late 18th century in British areas, but it was also shipped around because we know a lot of exporting of beer was going on as well. So British porter was shipped to ports along the Baltic Sea, arriving in countries like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Scandinavian regions along those other areas too.
Yeah, so you've got this beer that's coming over from England. We know how this goes. The locals in those regions where the beer's not necessarily being brewed yet are tasting this new porter and thinking, wow, this stuff's pretty good. But they're starting to get interested in brewing it themselves. If we can make it at our own breweries, then we won't have to pay so much to have it shipped over to us here. And I can understand how that works. Now, there's obviously going to be some limitations when you're brewing a beer in one country that was originated in another country. There are certain concessions, perhaps, that you're going to have to make, certain adaptations that you're going to have to go with in terms of creating kind of your own regional version of that porter. So the evolution of Baltic Porter is one that sort of makes sense to me. You've got these local brewers who are kind of riffing on this style that they enjoy, creating similar but different concoctions that were really tailored to the environment. And one thing about the Baltic region is that the winters are incredibly cold. So brewers, who are trying to warm themselves up during these really cold winters are looking for ways to kind of adapt this style of beer that they love so much to warm them up a bit. That's the way I think about it, at least, Andy.
Yeah. So you have this cold winters up there, and so making, I would say, first dark beers, I just find something appealing about a dark beer when it's cold out. I think that's just common.
Yeah.
There's the region of the coffee, chocolate, those kind of notes, toffee, and then alcohol content. I mean, you will, feel warmer. You won't be warmer, but you will feel warmer if the alcohol comes up a little bit. So due to various international conflicts going on, among other things, brewers in these regions began really relying on local ingredients rather than trying to get the export in from England. So the cooler temps of the region and likely some German influence in brewing. We know Germany has a lot of influence in the continental Europe for the brewing techniques. Mm-hmm. So these brewers tend to use lager yeast, which is why you always read these style guidelines. I always thought that was so funny. I read these style guidelines and I'm like, lager yeast in a strong, high alcohol beer. I was like, really? This really is going on? But that comes from the history of using German brewing techniques to make these styles in these areas. So it's always these little bits and pieces of things that you find when you read the history like this. It's interesting. So that's why it has lager yeast, because of the German influence.
Yeah, and that's something we're gonna focus on a little bit more later. But when I first heard Baltic Porter, I just thought, oh great, it's a porter that's made in the Baltic region, Russia. You've got Russia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all of that. Again, 15, 20 years ago, when I hear of this style, I'm thinking, okay, so it's just another porter, whatever. It's actually very distinct. And I feel like attaching the term porter to it can be kind of confusing, and perhaps that is just kind of an Americanism thing. I've been to Latvia. I have had Baltic Porter, the Alderis Mezpils Baltic Porter over there, and I believe they just call it porter. So it is still a porter, and my understanding is they do ferment it with a lager yeast. So the two distinguishing factors to me, if we're going to just simplify this thing down, and we're going to break the style down even more so in a bit, the two distinguishing factors compared to, say, an English porter or an American style porter is, one, it is actually a lager for the most part, and two, it is much higher strength. It's typically, you're pushing up in the around, I would say, average of about 8% ABV for a Baltic Porter. So you've got its strength and what it's fermented with, and I think that's fascinating. So when you're thinking about Baltic Porter, if you just think about those two things as being what makes it different from a regular porter, I think you're pretty safe.
I agree. Yeah, it's interesting. I've only done a few beers with lager yeast with the higher alcohols, and I think it really depends on the strain you use too. So if you're going to think about this style, that's something we'll get into. But we'll get into that into the ingredients. So I think we should break down this style itself so that we understand what we're working with here before we go and make it as fast as possible. So in appearance, it is color, as you could probably guess from the saying porter. It's a dark reddish copper to opaque dark brown. It shouldn't be black though. I think that's something sometimes people misconstrue with, like a stout porter.
Yeah.
Schwartz beer kind of thing, Czech dark lager. It's pretty dark. It's not completely dark, not super dark. So that's one thing.
Yeah, when it comes to color, that's one of those things where I'm like, man, it's pretty easy to get that really dark brown. But if you take a pint glass as opposed to, say, a Stange, and you pour the same beer in it, that it's going to look a lot darker or more black in the pint glass.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's a little, you don't need to marry yourself to that color thing. If it looks black in your Nonic, pint glass, but you pour it into a smaller glass and you get to see that dark brown, I think you're safe on that one. I wouldn't hang myself up too much on that. In terms of clarity, it really should be clear. This is a lagered beer for the most part. After all, darker versions, again, they can be opaque just by being dark, but again, it shouldn't be black. And in my head, black is the only thing that's really opaque. But it should not be hazy. That is not something you're looking for in a Baltic Porter.
Another thing to think about when you're making this style is foam, and it's the first thing you see, of course, after the color, and it's just be a persistent tan-colored head. That tan comes from the beer. The beer has got a darkness to it, and so that will translate into the foam. Yeah,
and there's, when it comes to foam color, I heard this kind of idea a few years ago, longer than a few years ago, that when you're using dark roasted barley, that the foam will stay white, but if you're using, say, dehusked roasted grains, which is fairly common in Baltic Porter, or other types of grains, chocolate malt, stuff like that it can actually influence the color of the head as well. Crystal malts, I believe, also influence the color of the head. But yeah, Baltic Porter is pretty much expected to have kind of a light tan, persistent, sticky head, and to stick around for a while, to have good retention. So in terms of the aroma, we're looking for rich malt with caramel, toffee, nuts, deep roast, or licorice notes, complex alcohol alcohol and ester profile of moderate strength is perfectly acceptable. You might pick up some plum, some prune, raisin, cherries, or currants, and it can have a port-like quality, which to me, I associate that with those darker fruit characteristics along with higher alcohol. When those two blend together, that's what I describe personally as kind of a port-like character.
Yeah, and it's interesting because they do mention ester profile, but we will be using a lager yeast, right? So you are pushing the lager yeast a little bit harder than maybe it wants to,
Sure.
But that's where some of those interesting flavors come from. And it should not be, in my opinion, it should not be like a strong notes, right? The yeast character. You're really looking for this malt to really carry it.
Yeah.
And I think it's when you sometimes use, and I'd be curious how you think about this, Marshall, when you sometimes use multiple darker grains together, that's when you get this like 2 + 2 = 5 effect, which we'll talk about later, I think.
Yeah, right. It's that the gestalt is, the sum is greater than its parts
Absolutely.
Idea,
Absolutely.
right? You can also get, because of the roasted grains you're using, a little dark chocolate, some coffee or molasses is appropriate, but it should never taste burnt according to the BJCP. You don't want it to taste like a dry stout, that more burnt acrid characteristic. That should be absent. You think about a Schwartz beer. That to me is what Baltic Porter sort of reminds me of. It's almost like an imperial Schwartz beer of sorts. It should have very little hop character. It should not be sour at all. It should be nice and smooth on the nose. You shouldn't be picking up any hops, in your nose. The flavor basically follows the aroma, a complex blend of rich malt character, dried fruit, caramel, toffee, nuttiness, some molasses, some licorice. Again, a Schwartz beer like roasted character that stops short of being burnt on the palate.
Yeah, you shouldn't get much roast ever in these beers just because it's not a stout and it has that lager character. It should be pretty clean. Just hints of these things. You want to, again, I think people go through, they read the style guidelines. They say, what's the difference between a porter and a stout? And honestly, we've gone through this too. And it's even the marketing of a commercial brewery doesn't know what the difference between a porter and stout is. But you should try to hem that way. What I do see, and I will call this out just as a style guideline, when you read style guidelines, if you're going to go to competition, when they say do not or light, think about that very carefully when you design your recipe, just so that other people, when they see it and they evaluate it, you're getting the fair shake, right? If you end up too roasty in your opinion, then it probably is too roasty for the style guideline people. So just think about that.
Exactly. And here's the truth of the matter. If you're aiming for a Baltic Porter and you end up with a higher strength, a dark chocolatey flavored roasted porter, it's probably still going to taste good. The issue is that it may not fit within the guidelines that the BJCP prescribes for Baltic Porter. Flavor wise, again, medium low to medium bitterness, just enough to balance that sweetness. You don't want this to be a bitter bomb, but you also don't want it to be cloying. No to medium low spicy hop character. Again, if there's that spicy hop character, it's likely because you used a lot of noble hops to get that bitterness, and so a little bit of it's coming through. But this is not a hoppy beer. This is a malt forward, clean fermented beer. And again, that fermentation profile, lager yeast for the most part really should be very clean. I don't understand the call on esters. I think alcohol esters, yes, because there's more alcohol there. We know alcohol has certain characteristics that are kind of ester driven. They're kind of fruity, but this should not be like an English, ester bomb by any means.
No. It's got to be clean. That's important. I think that's an important distinction between this and, say, a stout or porter that are using English ale yeast, which will have that traditional English character to it. This is a much cleaner beer. One of my we talk about the style guidelines or which ones, but there's some great ones in the United States. And when you have them, they definitely hold that to themselves, right? They use that clean lager yeast rather than a ale yeast for that very specific reason.
Yeah. In terms of mouthfeel, generally pretty full-bodied and smooth. This is a bigger beer. Alcohol warmth is appropriate, and in fact, the BJ, I like the way the BJCP describes it, that it can be deceptive. It doesn't taste like a boozy beer, and so they're really easy to drink. Next thing you know, you're not able to get your butt off the couch, right? Medium to medium high carbonation, which again, they say in the BJCP guidelines can contribute to the drinkability of this otherwise, a bigger beer, and that's part of what I love so much about Baltic Porter is that it really is you can drink a pint of it and not feel like you're drinking a double IPA, right? You don't have that fullness or that experience to me of fullness on the palate, or even once you swallow it, it's very, very drinkable despite that 7 to 8% general ABV. Pretty cool stuff. I really like this style a lot.
And I think that drinkability comes from the reduction on the hop bitterness and the use of lager yeast. If you think about IPA, which is something that people will more experience, like I know how I feel after a pint of IPA or something like that, versus this, I'm like, whoa, that's kind of caught me off guard, is that I think though I do enjoy having IPA as quickly as possible, it does stop you a bit because the bitterness checks you, and the alcohol, the esters from the ale yeast check you a bit more than say this. That's why I believe these darker beers get more drinkability out of them, is that you're not getting some of these kind of part and parcel things that you see from more commercial from the more popular IPAs or hoppy beers, is that those kind of put you in check while you're drinking them. So
yeah, no, totally. In terms of vital stats, you're looking at 1060 to 1090 OG. I mean, again, this is not a wimpy beer. This thing's pretty stiff. You got 1016 to 1024 FG, which should leave you with a beer of about 6.5 to 9.5% ABV. Usually the ones that I've had, the commercial examples I've had from both American breweries as well as European continental breweries, are right around that 7.5 to 8% mark. I think that's pretty standard. IBUs, you're looking at 20 to 40. So again, that bitterness is just there to balance the sweetness. You don't want to feel like you're drinking syrup. You want it to have a nice balance of bitterness and sweetness. And then in terms of color, you're looking at 17 to 30 SRM. In my experience, 30 SRM, again, when you pour that in a pint glass, it looks almost black. I mean, obviously it's not black like a stout. It's not your 50 SRM, but it's pretty doggone dark. 17, that's almost see-through brown, so pretty decent range there in terms of color. Characteristic ingredients, general recipe considerations when you're thinking about designing a recipe for Baltic Porter. What do you have to say about that, Andy?
Yeah, so you want to use a characterful base malt because you want something to play off of the other grains you'll be adding. I like to use like a Vienna or a Munich, something that has color to it that's going to set literally a base to the color of it. You can also use Pilsner malt too. I just think you want a little bit more character. I think you want some richness and some complexity. That's why I would go Munich or Vienna or something like that. And then you want to get some dark. You have to get dark color somehow. So one way to get clean dark color, if you've not tried it, is the Carafa products. They're German. They're de-bittered dark malt. They have a very clean bitterness to them. I think they come off a little bit chocolatey depending on with the level you use. They have a few different Lovabond levels. Very nice because you're not going to get any lower bitterness. You want that smoothness from the beer. You can use crystal malt. So those would be the 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. Those are the numbers, those Lovabonds. I would say, so you want to be somewhere in the 40 to 80 range, and depending on your style and what you like. And then, of course, pay attention to the manufacturer of that, because that'll change the flavor too. And then in historical versions, there's something called brown malt or amber malt, which are just different types of other malts used that have some color to them, so they don't have as much diastatic power, but they have unique characteristics and flavor to them that would make it style appropriate. So you want, again, these layers of flavor, because you don't want the beer to be just one note clean on your palate. You do need to develop some complexity.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the recommendation to go with something like Vienna or Munich malt as the majority base malt, I think, is spot on. Pilsner malt, we all know, is incredibly clean. I think in the Baltic Porters that I've made, which I believe I've only made 2, and that includes the one we're going to talk about here in a minute, I've always added a little bit of Pilsner malt because, in my mind at least, I feel like that kind of contributes to drinkability. I have no idea, if that's actually doing that or not. But something like Vienna with it, or a blend of Vienna and Munich, really can add just this richness that is not too much, but just right, especially for a big beer like that. I'm not a huge fan of brown malt. I've used it a handful of times, and every time I always pick up a weird note with it. But I could see how it would work really well in a Baltic Porter. Same with amber malt. They say in the BJCP for historical versions, in part because those were both very common malts in the UK at the time. And so in order to get that color, they were purportedly used back then. Another thing that you can do if you're in order to bump up that ABV, and it's apparently perfectly acceptable, at least according to the BJCP, is to use some form of sugar, whether that's just, table sugar, or you're adding some form of syrup or molasses. Again, highly fermentable, probably doesn't contribute too much in the terms of flavor, but it's also going to add a little bit of that drinkability because it'll thin that beer out a little bit, and make it, again, easier to swallow, not so rich in the mouth.
Yeah, I like the idea of using a more characterful sugar here. So like a palm sugar or maybe a molasses, just to get you more of that flavor that you already read the style guideline. It's already in there, right? Just use it, right? That's I think the best part. I think you want an even hand on this though. You don't want to get too much of it because I think there is a body aspect that you want to lose too much. So I'd be careful, more as a top note. especially maybe you're like, I just need something a little bit more richness out of it, then you can come back and try maybe a little bit of sugar. But yeah, it's interesting, and it's a cool little twist you can put on it and make it your own rather than just use normal barley malt.
Yeah, and one thing, I mean, if I'm making Baltic Porter, the only time I'm adding any sort of sugar to it is if I get to the end of my boil and I didn't hit the OG that I wanted. My efficiency wasn't good enough, and so I'm going to go and probably warm up that wort a little bit and maybe add a pound or so of sugar. I doubt I'm going to go anything over 5, maybe 8% sugar in total. My purpose being just to boost up that strength, and I think that's not a bad way to go about it. Hop character, you don't really want very much, and the hops that you're going to use will usually be either British or continental varieties, that kind of favor that spicy floral notes, which really aren't going to come through much in this beer anyways. Really, you're just using it for that bitterness to balance out the sweetness. Yeast, I think this is an interesting one. Lager yeast, I think, has become widely accepted as the standard for Baltic Porter, but it does say in the BJCP guidelines that ale yeast is appropriate so long as it's fermented cool, and apparently in Russia, if you're using ale yeast to ferment Baltic Porter, you actually have to ferment it cool. I don't know if that's some sort of weird like dictatorial rule that they have over there, but that's what it says in the guidelines. Kind of interesting.
Very interesting. Yeah, definitely. You learn something new every day. For this, you want to use just very traditional brewing processes, water chemistry. Mineral profile would favor the chloride to enhance the maltiness. I think this makes sense, and it's a very simple thing to do in your water profile if you have control over it. You could also just go with a more straight middle down the road balance profile. You're not looking for any one thing here. I think again, salt is like salting a dish. You're using it just to create a little bit more something else. So even hand here, nothing extreme.
I think when it comes to water chemistry, there's a lot of subjectivity in that. I mean, you look at to me, IPA is a perfect example. For years, it was all high sulfate, get that pop, and then here comes hazy IPA, which is like high chloride. You want it to be smooth and warm and blah blah blah. Same thing with Baltic Porter. It's gonna that to me is one of those things you can kind of do to tailor it to your own tastes. But yeah, I think given the fact that this is more of a malt forward beer, I think upping the chloride level a bit, at the very least, kind of balancing it with sulfates, probably fairly appropriate. In terms of the mash rest, I mean, I don't know about you, Andy, 60 to 90 minutes, pretty normal, 148 to 154 degrees Fahrenheit, which is right around 64 to 68 C, just to ensure that lower mash temperature kind of, ensures that good beta amylase activity and subsequent good fermentability.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for the going lower just to get the attenuation. I think we've done a lot of stuff with mash temperature, not people not seeing a difference, or at least we're not seeing a statistical difference.
Right.
I'll just say subjectively, I find this beer is not really on the 10+% category, but I have subjectively found that 10+% beers do have maybe the mash matters a little bit more. But to this one, I would be saying lower mash is good. I would probably be the 150 range right now, just to make sure you have not too much sweetness left over.
Exactly. The key with Baltic Porter is that you want it to have higher ABV, and one way to ensure that is to make it attenuative, to make a fermentable wort. And so that lower mash temp, we've shown over and over that it will absolutely do that. So
yeah. The boil, pretty standard, 60 to 90 minutes to get a isomerization of all your hop alpha acids and reduce DMS if that's something you're concerned about. Some people believe that this longer boil, say the 90+ minute boil, will add to kettle caramelization, which could add some complexity. I do think there is something to be said for like very long boils for concentrating wort, but that is raising your OG, right? So trade-offs, right? Run your calculations, understand your system. If you just want to, make sure you're getting the right bitters and stuff, 60 is perfectly fine. I personally, your system will dictate what you get and not get out of it. I think, having propane and having very high wattage things, that's something, right? So it's how you're going to get that other rich flavors, but you can also build that through mash too, right? So just, you have to play with the system and see where you end up.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're done with the mash, obviously, you said boil it for 60 to 90 minutes, obviously. Yeah. But when you're done with the boil, you're going to want to chill it as quickly as possible to ensure a good cold break. Again, this beer is supposed to be clear. And then you're going to let that cold break drop out, rack as little trub over to the fermenter as possible, and then you are going to ferment. If you're using lager yeast, obviously, you're going to aim for that 46 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit temperature. That's about 8 degrees to 10 degrees C. And if you're using ale yeast, I'm not sure what ale yeast I would probably a clean one. I'm not going to be throwing a Belgian yeast or anything into a Baltic Porter, though that might taste good. But you're looking at like 60 to 65F is what I found online, 16 to 18C. Again, just to suppress as much ester development as possible. I think the standard these days is that Baltic Porter is usually made with a lager yeast, so that's would probably be the recommendation. Once you let this beer completely ferment out, you can either batch lager it, in the fermentation vessel, or you can rack it over. You can do some fining, some filtration if you want to. Though, given the fact that this beer is intended to be aged for a bit, or lagered, if you will, it should have good clarity on its own without the addition of any of that stuff. I like to hasten the clarifying process, and so I will usually add stuff or use something there. But Baltic Porter, it's a bigger beer as well, right? And bigger beers widely believed to benefit from some time.
Absolutely. I would only hold this beer in this case just because I find that lager yeast may drive a little bit more alcohol, the sensation of alcohol. Even ale yeast at lower temperatures sometimes can do that too. So you can let it smooth out. And I mean, I think it's better. I think you're just going to enjoy the beer more if you've let it sit a bit. I think that's always better for beers that go, unless it's like IPA, of course, where you want to drink it fast. But then I think you're considering your fermentation a lot more. You're being a lot more careful with the yeast so that it is drinkable as soon as possible. So
Exactly. And then, of course, once the beer is ready and you've let it lager, for time, if you're doing batch lagering, of course, you're going to package it from that point. But once it's lagered, you want this thing to be nicely carbonated. That's, again, one of the factors contributing to drinkability is that higher level, moderate to moderate high carbonation. I couldn't agree more with that. It is a lager, after all, and there's not a single lager out there that I don't like with a lot of fizz in it. And so that's kind of my preference for this as well. I'd say, traditionally, you're looking at a 6 to 8 week lagering period, maybe longer, depending on the strength of the beer. Obviously, there are some people who will let them age for 5 years or whatever. You do you on that. But typically speaking, traditionally speaking, I think you're around that 8 week mark is usually when people will feel comfortable drinking their Baltic Porter. Now, what to look for in a good example of the style? We've already spent a lot of time talking about it, but in my mind, putting all of this stuff together, you're looking for rich malt that's not burnt and balanced by hop bitterness with minimal hop aroma or flavor. It should be deceptively drinkable given its higher ABV, though some complex alcohol notes are acceptable. A slight warming in higher ABV examples is also perfectly acceptable and not necessarily looked down upon. It can actually be kind of a nice thing to perceive that in the colder, Baltic months. Notable examples, I already mentioned one, Alderdus Mej Pils Porteris out of Riga, Latvia, is one that I've had quite a bit of, actually. It's very, very delicious. It's actually the first one mentioned by the BJCP as well. There's Baltica 6 Porter out of St. Petersburg, Russia. And then there's an American one out of Roseland, Virginia's Devil's Backbone Danzig, another one that I've had quite a bit of that's fascinating, or just fantastic. Super good. Have you had any local Baltic Porters, Andy, that you can point out?
I was thinking about this while we were talking, and the only thing that comes to mind was I don't believe they call it Baltic Porter. They call it Imperial Porter, but I believe it's in the similar vein. There's Shadow of a Doubt by Russian River Brewing Company. It is named after the Hitchcock movie that was taped up in Santa Rosa. It's really good. I don't think he considers it. I don't know if he uses lager yeast, but it has these kind of characteristics of that higher alcohol, that richness, but not that roast character you would be perceiving in like a stout or something, in my opinion. So I think they come on tap. These kind of beers come on tap every once in a while. Local brew pub, the brewer's like, hey, I haven't done this style before, I'm going to fire one up, and it's usually pretty good because they're usually they wouldn't approach those styles if they weren't making dark beers already, so they usually know what they're doing. So yeah, always a treat.
I think that's funny that you point out that this is definitely one of those styles that you're not going to find in most brew pubs, at least yet. But when they are there, it's usually the brewer like, man, I just want to try something new. I'm sick of making hazy IPA and Kolsch, so they move in. Oh, let's try Baltic Porter. It's a style I've never brewed before. But when you find a good one, I'm telling you, you're going to be really happy. Now, as much as I loved the Baltic Porter I had while I was in Latvia, as well as the various versions from American breweries that I've tried over the years, I never really got around to brewing one myself. That is until a few years ago when I thought it'd be fun to see how a version of this hefty lager made with short and shoddy methods would turn out. Results from that when we're back from this break. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Not only is it higher strength and dark, but Baltic Porter is typically made with lager yeast and spends a good amount of time conditioning prior to being consumed. Now, given my penchant for brewing masochism, I made a batch where I threw many of the traditional approaches to making this style out the window. I brewed this on my 240 volt electric system. It was a full volume brew in a bag. That's my standard approach these days. And I started at 9:12 a.m., 9:12 in the morning. I collected the full volume of filtered water, which I adjusted with just gypsum only. I did not add any calcium chloride. Now, my water that I use at my house, it's tap water that I filter through an RV, a carbon filter. It is very, very neutral. It has, I think it's like it comes like 6 sulfate, 4 chloride or something. So I added an unmeasured amount of gypsum just because I like that crispness in any lager beer that I make. So I kind of went off the trail a little bit there as well, because I think most people would favor the chloride, but I wanted that crispness in the beer. The grain bill, pretty simple. I did 33% Mecca grade Metolius Munich style malt. I did 33% Mecca grade Venora Vienna style malt, 27% Mecca grade Pelton Pilsner malt, and then 4% C60 and 3% roasted barley. Andy, I used roasted barley. This is going to be a stout. Yep, I know.
Yeah. Can't believe you did this.
Well, I was all out of dehusked dark grains, so this is short and shoddy. I was like, oh crap, yeah, I've got a whole bucket of roasted barley. Might as well use some of that. Yeah, and again, it was 3%. Now we've done some experiments in the past that have suggested that roasted barley is not that different from these dehusked carafa grains. So let's see how this turns out. When the water was to strike temperature, the grains were added and incorporated before checking to ensure it was at my target mash temperature of 152 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 67 C. The very full mash tun was left for 30 minutes. It was like right on the brim of my kettle, and pretty heavy bag of grains at the same time. So very full mash was left for 30 minutes, after which the grains were removed. Thankfully, I've got a hoist that I use to kind of pull the grain bag out. I brought the wort up to a boil and added, I added 21 grams of 3-year-old Hallertauer Mittelfrüh and 20 grams of Magnum before the wort was at a boil for a first wort hop, just to ensure I got that bitterness from them. And then I boiled the wort for just 20 minutes. 20 minutes, it's got Pilsner malt, Vienna malt, Munich malt, C60, and roasted barley. 20 minutes seems pretty low compared to the standard of 60 or 90, right?
Yeah, that's pretty quick. But though, I mean, I think in the end, like I said about recipe development earlier, right? You don't have to brew, so you don't have to boil long if you think your recipe has developed the right character in it, right? If you're, especially the type of system you're using, boiling long is not going to develop the characters that you get from like a direct fire system or something like that, where there's actually fire touching the kettle that's getting very, very hot, right? So there's a difference there. So I think that in this case, I don't think you're missing anything from that unless you design your recipe again to be the 90 plus minute type boil. So.
Well, you're wrong, Andy. I'm going to get DMS in this beer no matter what, because that's what they say, right? So yep. So when the boil was complete, just 20 minutes later, I chilled the wort to as cool as I could get it with my groundwater, which was 71 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 degrees Celsius. I used my Jaded Scylla IC. You got to check these immersion chillers out from Jaded Brewing. Yeah. They're made specifically for electric brewing systems, so pretty cool stuff. I then checked the OG, and it was at 1065, which was pretty awesome. That's within the guidelines. But it also indicated a 55% brew house efficiency. When I've brewed a lot of these short and shoddy batches. I've also done a lot of just standard brew in a bag batches. The higher the OG, the bigger the beer, the lower my efficiency is overall. It doesn't matter what approach I'm using to brewing. What I found is with this short and shoddy thing, at about 30 minutes, I get maybe 5 to 6% lower efficiency on beers that are 1055 or higher than I would if I did a full 60-minute mash. That to me is not a big deal. If I can cut out 40 minutes, if I can cut out a half an hour of my brew day, or even more, that is literally equivalent to maybe a pound of grain, which is like, I don't know, $1. And to me, it's worth it. So that's one of the things that makes the short and shoddy thing justifiable for me. I don't know, 55% brew house efficiency. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's good. I mean, again, I think that's all about calculation and being aware that you need to add more grain to get the numbers you want, right? I mean, in the end, it's just knowing your system. And in this case, in this specific case, we're trying to be efficient with time. Yeah. Cost is not the current thing we're optimizing right now. So.
Yeah. No, I agree. And that also, this was one of the quickest brew days for a big beer. So it's worth it in my book. I then racked that 71 degree Fahrenheit or 22 degree Celsius wort onto a yeast cake of Imperial Yeast L28 Urkel, a fantastic yeast strain for lagers that had previously fermented in Märzen. And so there wasn't much Märzen left, obviously. And I figured, you know what? That Märzen had a bunch of Munich malt in it, had a bunch of the same grains. I think I might have even used the same hops. Perfect for racking this big beer onto, and didn't seem like a big issue to me. A lot of people I know use those fresh wort right onto a used yeast cake.
Yeah, easy peasy. I would just, you could end up over pitching, but it's so hard to over pitch. I would not be worried about it at all.
Yeah, I think technically it's fairly easy to overpitch. It's hard to get the overpitched off flavors. That's what I've found. You know what I'm saying? Like technically it was an overpitch by quite a bit. But really, in the times where I've overpitched, it's not like I'm getting crazy off flavors. It's just fermentation happens faster, which I like. So I then placed the fermentation vessel in a chamber that was controlled to 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees Celsius. This was lager yeast, should be fermented at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees C, give or take. And I fermented it at ale fermentation temperature. So again, not only is this going to be a DMS bomb, it's going to have esters galore.
Can't believe you would do this to us, Marshall. I don't why it would brew this beer. I would just have dumped it out already.
At this point, the time was 11:08 a.m. for a total brew day time of 1 hour and 56 minutes. I made it under 2 hours. If I added cleanup time in there, it was about 2 hours and 15 minutes total. But hey, cleanup is cleanup. So fermentation kicked off within a couple hours and was really active for the following few days, as you might imagine. I actually connected the vessel to I did my whole jumper harvesting naturally produced CO2 thing where I have one keg full of Star San solution, and then that has a jumper to an empty keg, and that empty keg has the PRV pulled so that you can the naturally produced CO2 basically purges the first keg by pushing the liquid into the second keg, and then I racked into that keg later on. So normally it takes about 18 to 24 hours for that first keg to empty. This one, it was emptied by the night I pitched. It was going hard. And the second keg, the full keg now, that was basically acting as the kind of blow-off bucket, was just bubbling like crazy. So very, very strong fermentation, which was predicted based on the fact that I racked this higher OG wort onto that yeast cake. After 5 more days, activity was absent, so I took hydrometer measurements showing that the beer was at a rather dry 1013 FG. So that lower, again, it may be a function of the reduced mash length. Perhaps a function of the reduced boil, though I don't think that's the case. But definitely that kind of lower, what was it, 152 degrees Fahrenheit mash temp, I think, really came into play here. And 1065 down to 1013 FG left us with a 6.9% ABV beer, which I think is pretty great.
That's good. That's a good number. I like that. It's not, I might have wanted a little bit more alcohol from it, but for short and shoddy and the lower brew house efficiency, I mean, this makes sense. But it's right in a good number. It's above it's above just a warm porter, right? You're getting something out of it that you wouldn't get from just porter. So.
Yeah. I was happy with where we were at that point. I let the beer sit another 2 days just to confirm that the FG wouldn't change. And when it didn't, I cold crashed down to 33 degrees Fahrenheit or 1 degree Celsius overnight. And then I did add some gelatin fining, and I let the beer sit another 5 days before pressure transferring the beer to that naturally purged keg and placing that keg in my keezer and burst carbonating it for 18 hours. I think I did 45 psi for 18 hours, and then I dropped it down to 14 psi, which is my serving pressure. And then I let it sit for just 6 days of no 6 weeks, no 6 months. We went with 6 days of conditioning, Andy. Very, very astute conditioning person I am over here. And then that's when I served it to tasters for evaluation. What would you expect of a 6.9% alcohol Baltic Porter that has all the it's roasted character, fermented with a lager yeast, all of this that was conditioning for just 6 days?
I mean, I don't think it would taste very good. I think I would probably give it a 25 out of 50. I don't think it would even make the BJCP like first round. So,
well, let's see what other people thought of it. I'll share my opinion, of course. So in terms of the appearance, it was dark brown and very clear with a very persistent tan head. That lines up perfectly with the BJCP. So just if you're judging a book by its cover, Andy, would you say, looking at the picture, that it hit the mark?
Yes, it did hit the mark in terms of appearance.
So on appearance alone, I get a 50 out of 50. That's great. Okay, so
right.
Brewers, we tend to be our own worst critics, which is definitely true for me. But I have to say, man, this Baltic Porter was delicious. It hit all the marks laid out by the BJCP, in my opinion. It was malty without being too rich or sweet. It was strong without being too boozy. And surprisingly, it was easy to drink. I mean, for 6.9% dark beer like this, it was I'd fill up a whole pint and it'd be gone in like less than 10 minutes. It was so good. I loved it. But what would other people think? That's really what matters here with this short and shoddy series. So I ended up serving this beer to 21 tasters. All participants were informed of the style, and they were asked to evaluate it based on both any prior experiences that they may have had with Baltic Porter, as well as the description that the BJCP provides of Baltic Porter. So they know what they're tasting, and they're just asked to rate a beer that they know the style of, which I think is fair.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like, here's the style guidelines, and you just please evaluate it, and I think that makes sense, right? That's you can't really ask much more of that. It's not a blind judging, right? Where you're like, I try to guess the style or something like that too. So.
Yeah. Well, we started off doing that, and I don't think it worked out very well. Nobody could guess the style. It just seemed kind of a futile. So we started telling people what the style is. What we don't tell them is how it's brewed, and I think that's key.
Yes.
So they're blind to the short and shoddy approach to this. All right. So in terms of the average characteristic rating, how hoppy, malty, and dry the beer is, tasters seem to perceive the strongest characteristics as being malty and dryness, which yielded average ratings of about 3.2 and 2.8 out of 5, respectively. Ratings on hoppy were really low, 1.6 out of 5. To me, again, this fits the bill for Baltic Porter.
Yep, nailed it. So you're very impressive for doing a beer I thought would be just terrible. So this sounds like you're hitting the marks.
All right, to break down all of the other the kind of ingredient characteristics in terms of hop character, 13 out of 21 people rated earthiness as being the most prominent characteristic. 3 out of 21 said spicy, 2 out of 21 said fruity, and 1 each rated pine resinous, melon, and berry. Nobody endorsed floral, dank caddy, or onion garlic. Now, this is not a hoppy beer. We ask the question anyways, and so they have to put something, and we require that they put something. So the fact that more than half of the people rated it as earthy, and then pretty much everybody else did either spicy or fruity, that makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, you're not using a lot of you're not using crazy hops in this one, and earthy makes sense. And I was going to comment earlier about recipe development. I think you do want some type of noble hop character or something like that is going to provide that earthy, spicy, woody thing that a dark beer really works well with. So
yeah. Malt character, again, this kind of jibes with what you'd expect for a Baltic Porter. 8 out of 21 people rated it as roasty. 4 said it was toasty. 3 each rated cracker, bread crust, nutty, caramel sweet, and then nobody endorsed chocolate, which to me, when you hear roast, I think that your eyes kind of cause you to perceive, this is going to taste roasty because it's dark, and we know that dark beers are roasty. So there's probably an element of that, like the just visual perception kind of influencing what we're perceiving on our palate. I can't say that for sure, but roast, toast, cracker bread crust, nutty, caramel sweet, those are all perfectly acceptable components of a good Baltic Porter. So that to me makes sense as well. I don't think it's surprising that nobody endorsed chocolate. I don't. I didn't perceive it either. Do you expect Baltic Porter to have a chocolate component to it, or?
I mean, it's possible. I think it's just how your palate interprets it, right? I think that the recipe you outlined with what we're seeing here makes sense. I'm always kind of one to throw chocolate in there if I'm thinking I'm getting anything that has any sweetness. So I think your reduction in sweetness would allow you to not have the chocolate.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense to me too. Now, this one is kind of confounding to me, but I think I have an explanation for it, and I don't want it to sound like a rationalization. It's just kind of an idea. Sure. In terms of yeast character, the most prominent yeast character pointed out by tasters, 10 out of 21 tasters noted esters, 6 put phenolics, 4 put clean, 1 put sulfur, and 0 thought it was nobody thought there was a wild yeast character. My thoughts on this are that, again, I mentioned it earlier, that people were probably picking up the higher alcohols, that kind of alcohol ester, but I know that people are going to say, "Ha, got it. That's what you got from the fermenting a lager yeast at 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19°C." I get it. I get the knee-jerk reaction to want to explain it away like that, and maybe that's the case. But I have done this so many times with Urkel in particular, and I've never gotten esters from it. This beer had that really interesting dark cherry fruity thing, and on the survey, when we put esters, we put fruity, and we put pear, apple, whatever the esters are, and then phenolics. We put it ranges from smoky to chlorophenols and describe those characteristics. Well, smoky, roasty, all of those things kind of go together. This is a rich Baltic Porter that doesn't, on its own, I don't think anybody would describe as clean. And so when you're asking specifically about yeast character, I don't know if clean would be the first thing a lot of people would note it as being. I don't know. I could be wrong on that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeast is a funny thing, right? It adds these nuances that sometimes are very prominent, adds off flavors that you can't avoid them in the parts per billion, but also adds like the kind of a palette it's kind of like the paper you paint when you paint on something, right? It's the paper below it. The paper is adding texture and color to the final product as well. So
yeah. Well, here's the interesting thing. So despite that weird rating on the yeast character, only one person out of 21 noted there being any off flavors, and they felt it was oxidation. So they didn't rate that it was an estery off flavor or fruitiness or phenolics. Nobody else rated any other off flavors. And then we ask how well this short and shoddy version, which they don't know that it's short and shoddy, but how well this homebrewed version of Baltic Porter represents the style based on what the BJCP describes it as. 1 out of 21 people gave it a 5 out of 5. So they thought it was a perfect example. Another 9 people rated it a 4 out of 5, and then 10 more people rated it a 3 out of 5. To me, that 3 out of 5 mark, that kind of center line, is that would be the mode. That's not terrible. That means it's fairly in line with what they would expect based on the description provided by the BJCP. One person rated it a 2 out of 5, and nobody gave it a 1 or a 0 out of 5. So this thing arguably may not have been, based on the ratings of this set of tasters, may not have been a perfect example of Baltic Porter, but it sure was close. It was right in line.
Yeah. That's good. That's awesome. It's good to see the numbers come out like this. This is great.
And then after we ask how well it represents the style, we ask tasters for their preference. So basically, if you think it was absolutely delicious, you want to order like 3 more pints, you're going to give it a 5 out of 5, all the way down to a 0 out of 5, which means blah, I would never drink this stuff again. 5 people rated it a 5 out of 5. So that's pretty good, right? They're almost a quarter of the people thought it was an excellent tasting beer, whether it was Baltic Porter or not. Another 12 gave it a 4 out of 5. So 12 more people were like, this thing's pretty damn good. Not perfect, but it is pretty good. And then 4 more people gave it a 3 out of 5. That's everybody. Nobody rated it a 2, 1, or a 0 out of 5, which is one of the better preference ratings that I've seen on one of these short and shoddy batches. I don't know. I think it's pretty validating.
Mm-hmm. No, this is great. And it represents the style. Okay, so it's not everyone's a BGCP judge. They don't have the styles memorized. They're not thinking that way. They don't have a score sheet in front of them.
Right.
But then to actually appreciate the beer more is really cool, right? You made a good beer. You in your techniques and spending time that you could have spent twice or three times as much time, and for what benefit? I mean, maybe preferences, maybe style representation wise, but you nailed it for people enjoying the beverage, which in the end is all I really care about. So.
Oh, I mentioned before how brewers, myself included, tend to be our own worst critics. I mean, I can't tell you how many times one of my brewing friends has brought a beer over to share with me and is like, I think there's something wrong with it, taste it. And I'm like, dude, this is like a 42, 44 point beer. If I'm judging it, that was kind of how I felt about this one. I kept questioning my own perception of this beer because I just thought it was so on point and so good compared to, I went out and bought a Baltic Porter that it wasn't one of the big name ones, but I found a Baltic Porter at the Total Wine just for a comparison. And I actually preferred mine over this one. And they had similar characteristics. I think the only deterring factor in the commercial one was that its age, and it was sitting on a warm shelf. Mine was fresh. It was clean. It wasn't even that old. And it still just had this really nice malt complexity without being too overbearing. It was easy to drink. It didn't have anything negative about it. I would have probably scored it somewhere, but I want to try to be humble here, but somewhere between the 38 and 42 mark is where I would have, if I was served this beer, in a competition, that's probably where I would have settled on a score. I liked this one a lot. It's one of my favorite short and shoddy batches that I've brewed to date. So that's what I'm giving myself, Andy. It's going to beat your 25.
Well, good. No, it's great. I mean, again, this is the experimentation that we want, right? We want this data out there so people understand what they can and can't do with the time that they have, if they can get to numbers they like. So,
well, and that's kind of the impressive part of it. This was a really well received Baltic Porter that was arguably largely to style, according to tasters, many of whom probably don't have that much experience with Baltic Porter in general, anyways. And given the general absence of noted off flavors, it seemed to me that the short and shoddy approach didn't have really much of a negative impact other than that lower efficiency, which again, if you're okay with that, then go for it. And I guess a part of me just wants people to who might be like shying away from brewing certain styles because of temperature control limitations or time limitations. You're a parent or you've got multiple jobs or whatever. 2 hours is 2 hours. And if you can get away with making a delicious Baltic Porter, even if it doesn't win best of show, it may very well be a great beer. And I think this recipe in particular is one I would brew it again exactly how it was. In the future, if I was to change anything, I would probably, I don't know. I actually don't know what I would change. I would probably swap out the roasted barley with something more style appropriate just to see how it comes across. Maybe that roast rating would have gone down a little bit more if it was Carafa, but ultimately I was absolutely pleased with this beer and was proud to call it a Baltic Porter. We'll call it that way. So now we did get some reader comments. First one comes from Carl Helmstetter. He said, the beer looks great. Glad it came out well. You're right that they normally pack some Carafa too. And I like some dark Munich as well to accentuate the malty roast character without adding too much bitterness. Ooh, using a darker Munich. That's kind of a good idea in my mind.
Yeah, I like that one. No, I was going to say up the Munich number to get a little more richness out of it. Yes.
So my experience, I've never brewed with dark Munich, in part because the beers that I've had from other homebrewers that are made with big amounts of it, I get an interesting, almost like cooked sourdough bread character out of it that I'm not a huge fan of. I remember the first time I said that to somebody, they presumed I was talking about like a sourdough starter, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that really nice bready character, almost toasted bread, but it's sourdough bread. It's not, it's not your regular white bread or something like that. And to me, that doesn't. I'm not a big fan of the way that conveys itself in most of the styles of beer that would call for a darker Munich. So I'll use other malts to kind of get that toasty, bready character. But yeah, it sounds like it would be a great addition to a nice, rich Baltic Porter with that roasted grain and that crystal malt and the strength. I think it would work really well. Next comment comes from Peter. He says, I've brewed this style once. I might have been concerned that the roasted barley would push the roast level out of style, but it sounds like you don't think it did. For dark beers with subdued roast, I've played around with cold steeping part of my roasted malts when I don't have dehusked versions on hand to try for a milder roast level. But that's not the short and shoddy way. And you guys probably have an experiment that suggests cold steeping doesn't matter. We sure do, Peter. We actually have a couple of them, I believe.
Yeah, we do have those that data, and those came back not significant. So, I mean, like I think we've alluded to earlier in the episode, using debittered or not is not necessarily the modernization of so many grains. I think have minimized the negative astringent. These flavors that these concepts or these flavors that are in some style guidelines are really about ingredients that don't exist anymore, in my opinion, or at least the modernization of the techniques to show you that they don't matter. So.
Oh, I get so nervous talking about stuff like this because they are established like brewing rules. The reality is, the things that I've come to question when it comes to things like roasted grains are many. We'll put it that way. We've done comparisons of black malt and roasted barley, both included in the full mash. And people can't tell those things apart. And I've spent years convinced that black malt was what you used to get that acrid, ashy character. Roasted barley is what you used to get a more smooth roasted character. And these days, I'd be fine using either interchangeably. And I know there are people out there who are probably flailing with me saying that, but that's just me. Final comment comes from Mark. He says, that's a lot of folks who listed phenolics as an attribute, but you listed the profile as pretty clean. Any thoughts as to why? My thoughts, before Andy says your piece, my thoughts are what I mentioned earlier, that because we, in the description of phenolics that we have in our survey, we include some words that might kind of allude to more roasty characteristics as opposed to what we know to be that phenolic clovey off character in a beer like this. That's why I think that. Same thing with the esters. I think when you've got a bigger beer, this was almost 7% alcohol, fermented with a lager yeast, with all of those kind of darker fruit notes that you get from this kind of a style, I think it's easy to misinterpret that as perhaps being esters in the same way that you might misinterpret that darker roasted character as being phenolics for somebody who may not be as experienced, which there's an argument there. Well, you got to serve these to all people who are, Cicerones or BJCP judges. That's not our interest, but I do think that that may be at play at the very least.
Yeah, it's possible. I think sometimes I can get a sense of phenolic from some darker grains. I think it just kind of depends on the setting. It depends, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think that, again, I'm my own worst critic here, and I'm very confident that there were no notable phenolics in this beer. I also didn't perceive strong esters other than what I got from that really light alcohol note in the nose. But you know what? We have subjective ways of perceiving things, and our preferences are subjective. In the end, this beer seemed to turn out. People seemed to like it. It was pretty close to the style, and I was pleased with it. So there you go. If you want to brew a Baltic Porter and you don't have that much time, give this a go. I think it'll work out well for you. Well, that's all we've got for Baltic Porter. Andy, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I like this style a lot. I don't brew enough of it. That's my problem. But I do like the idea of this quicker way of making it, and just trying it out and see what you think, and then tweaking it to this. And like I kind of always tell people, know your system well. And if your system is now developed to brew beers fast, then tweak the recipes and then get what you want out of it. And like I said, maybe a sugar addition could be interesting here too. So
absolutely. And there are various types of sugars you can add to this type of a style, I think, that could really accentuate some of the characteristics that are supposed to be there anyway. So short and shoddy. Don't be afraid to step outside the bounds of what you're told you have to do in order to keep yourself brewing. That's what I love about it. All right. Remember to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where host Kate Job takes you into the lab with brewing experts so you're notified when new episodes drop. And don't forget, you can click the link in the description of this episode to read all about this short and shoddy Baltic Porter. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.